So I have this other piece that I'm going to do a bonus video for you because it's a different type of material than the other type that I just walked you through, and it's a very popular type of material. It is particle board, so with a laminate overlay. You can see some of that damage that happens very frequently on particle board. You can see that chip coming through. It can easily be fixed, but first, just give it a nice clean. It's been sitting out in my garage for a little bit, so it wasn't that dirty, just dusty. For cleaning, I'm actually just using water and dish Dawn soap, just a little bit to give this a nice little scrub because again, it's really not that dirty. And with these particle board kind of put together yourself furniture pieces, they come with these little screw covers, and I'm going to be painting this and I don't want the screw heads to show through the paint, so I'm actually using these countersink drill bits to get the screw to sink down into the laminate itself, and then I will be covering that up with some Bondo that I will show you later. And I did it on each and every one of these screw heads because you want that nice seamless design after you paint. So after all those screws were done, I grabbed Bondo all-purpose putty. This is my favorite wood filler to use on really deep holes like I have with these screw holes that I've created myself. And it's just a two-part epoxy. You mix some of the hardener that comes with it, stir it up. Don't mix too much up at a time because this stuff dries fast, which is also like a huge positive in my opinion. But because it dries so fast while you're working with it, a lot of it can dry out if you mix up too much ahead of time. So I mix up little bits at a time, apply it just by using, you can see I'm using a plastic knife there. That's fine. However you want to apply it on, because you're going to let it dry and then sand it smooth afterwards. And once it dries, I'm using 180 grit sandpaper, putting it on my sander and just sanding it nice and smooth until it's a nice, smooth, flat surface. And then I went ahead and scuff sanded the rest of the piece using this same 180 grit sandpaper. Sometimes I'll use 220 grit. 180 is perfect too. Since it was already on my sander, I went ahead and used it. Bondo all-purpose putty is a relatively smelly chemical, so make sure that you're wearing your mask when you're applying it and then also as you're sanding it smooth. And once I finish sanding it, I use my tack cloth to remove all of that excess dust because the next step is to prime it. And I also removed this backing. I'm going to replace the backing completely because these are cheap, just cardboard material. And if I painted it, it would look cheap. But this is my favorite primer to use on this type of surface. I showed you in the other video as well. It goes on really easily because it's a spray can. And to paint these cubbies can be a pain in the butt. So using a spray can like this makes it go by so much faster. I love using this primer. It's an oil-based primer. So when it touches that particle board, it just seals it up instead of making it swell like it does with any type of water-based paint. And after priming, I noticed there were some small pinholes that I still needed to fill to make it a nice smooth finish. I just used some of that Bondo glaze, applied it, and once it dried, I sanded it smooth with 180 grit again. And it was time for paint. This time I am going to be spraying it because these cubbies are too hard to paint by hand. So if you are doing one of these, I highly recommend you invest in a paint sprayer. This is my favorite one and it's so inexpensive. A lot of times you can find it less than $100. I am just using a latex paint that I actually used on my wall in my guest room. Because it's not a furniture paint, it doesn't self-level very well. So I'm using Floetrol and it helps self-level the paint to a nice smooth finish. Highly recommend you thinning your paint with this if you are using a latex based paint. A paint sprayer is not necessary to begin furniture flipping, but if you plan to do more than 2 to even 3 pieces that are painted, I highly encourage you to look at a paint sprayer just because it can save you a lot of time and then as a result a lot of money. And in terms of ratio of Floetrol to paint, I just kind of eyeball it, to be honest. Sometimes it ends up being about 1/3, but this actually was a little too much, I think, so maybe lessen the ratio. There are instructions on it that I highly encourage you to read, like I didn't in this case. And once the first coat of paint dried, I grabbed 400 grit sandpaper, a sanding block, and then gave it a quick sand to remove any texture that was there. And before moving on to the second coat, I went ahead with a tack cloth and wiped off all of that dust. For the second coat of paint, I'm adding in my polyacrylic just to give it some more durability. I don't have a particular ratio. I just kind of put in maybe 1/3 of poly to paint. The ratio changes all the time. I have tried this many different ways and it's kind of foolproof. So go ahead, give it a shot, and it's a perfect way to get a streak-free finish when you're adding a top coat to your paint, especially when you're using dark colors. And then after this dries, it will be ready dark to green. Go. It tends to be streaky when you apply a top coat, and this helps avoid that completely by adding that top coat to your paint.